In the heart of England, behind high concrete walls and layers of steel security, stands a prison once described by inmates themselves as the Monster Mansion. It was not built to be famous. It was built to contain the most dangerous men in the United Kingdom, individuals considered too violent, too unpredictable, or too high risk for ordinary prisons. Over the years, riots erupted, officers were injured, investigations were launched, and serious questions began to emerge about control inside Britain's highest security system. How could one of the most secure prisons in Europe repeatedly lose order from within? And what really happened behind the walls of HM Prison Wakefield, the facility many came to call Britain's deadliest prison? This documentary examines the real and verified history behind HM Prison Wakefield, a maximum security prison in West Yorkshire, England. Often referred to in media reports as the UK's most dangerous prison, Wakefield has housed some of the country's most serious offenders for decades. Its reputation did not come from myth or rumor, but from documented incidents, official inspections, and government investigations. The events discussed here are presented for public education and historical understanding. This is not a story about glorifying crime or individuals. It is a story about prison systems, security challenges, institutional pressure, and the ongoing struggle to safely manage extreme offenders within a modern justice system. To understand why Wakefield earned the nickname the Monster Mansion, we must first go back to how it became one of Britain's most feared correctional institutions. The making of a high-risk prison. HM Prison Wakefield opened in 1594, originally built as a house of correction during a very different era of British justice. Over centuries, the facility evolved alongside the legal system itself. By the late 20th century, Wakefield had transformed into something entirely different. A Category A prison, the highest security classification in the United Kingdom. Category A prisoners are defined by the government as individuals whose escape would pose a serious threat to the public or national security. Wakefield became one of the main locations chosen to hold these inmates. Its population began to include convicted murderers, organized crime figures, and offenders considered too dangerous for standard high-security wings elsewhere. To manage this risk, specialized units were introduced, including segregation blocks designed to isolate prisoners who could not safely mix with others. But isolation created new pressures. Staff faced constant operational strain. Prisoners lived under extreme restrictions. Trust between inmates and officers became increasingly fragile. By the early 2000s, Wakefield was no longer just a secure prison. It had become a concentration point for some of the most difficult prisoners in the entire UK system. Then came a series of incidents that forced authorities, and the public, to confront a troubling question. Was maximum security actually creating stability, or quietly increasing tension inside the walls? The answer would begin to emerge after one of the most serious internal crises the prison had faced. When control began to slip. By the early 2010s, HM Prison Wakefield was operating under intense pressure. Across the United Kingdom, prisons were facing rising inmate populations, staffing shortages, and increasing concerns about safety inside high-security facilities. Wakefield, already responsible for managing some of the country's most challenging prisoners, felt these pressures more than most. Official inspection reports began to highlight warning signs. Staff numbers were stretched. Experienced officers were leaving faster than new ones could be trained. Managing Category A prisoners required constant supervision, careful intelligence gathering, and strong relationships between staff and inmates, systems that became harder to maintain as resources tightened. Inside Wakefield, tension slowly grew. Segregation units, designed to maintain order, were being used more frequently. Prisoners who struggled to adapt to strict control spent long periods separated from the general population. While intended as a safety measure, prolonged isolation often increased frustration rather than reducing conflict. Small disturbances started to occur. Refusals to follow routine instructions. Damage to cells. Standoffs that required specially trained response teams. None of these incidents alone defined the prison, but together they revealed a system under strain. Then, in 2016, a serious incident brought national attention back to Wakefield. A prison officer was attacked during routine duties, triggering emergency procedures within the facility. The event prompted renewed scrutiny from prison authorities and raised concerns about whether even Britain's most secure prison could fully protect its staff. Investigations followed. Reports examined staffing levels, supervision practices, and risk management policies inside high-security wings. Questions were asked not only about individual behavior, but about the wider environment officers were working in every day. For many observers, the incident marked a turning point. Wakefield was no longer seen simply as a prison holding dangerous individuals. It was becoming an example of how difficult it had become to manage extreme risk within an overstretched correctional system. And as officials worked to restore stability, another challenge was quietly developing, one that would test the limits of control inside the so-called Monster Mansion even further. Inside Britain's highest-risk unit. Following growing safety concerns, attention increasingly turned toward one specific part of HM Prison Wakefield, its close supervision center, often referred to as the CSC system. The CSC units were created for prisoners considered exceptionally difficult to manage, even within maximum security prisons. These were individuals who had demonstrated repeated violence, serious disruption, or behavior that posed ongoing risks to staff or other inmates. Wakefield became one of the main locations used to house this small but highly complex population. Life inside these units followed strict structure. Prisoners spent most of their time alone in secure cells. Movement was carefully planned. Interactions were limited and monitored. Every routine, meals, exercise, medical visits, required coordination between multiple officers. The goal was clear: prevent harm while maintaining control. But maintaining control came at a cost. Independent monitoring boards and inspection bodies began reporting concerns about the long-term effects of extreme restriction. While the system aimed to protect safety, critics questioned whether prolonged separation could increase tension rather than reduce it. Managing behavior became increasingly complex. Officers were required not only to enforce rules but also to recognize early warning signs of instability. Communication skills became as important as physical security measures. A single misjudged interaction could quickly escalate into confrontation. At the same time, Wakefield continued to receive prisoners transferred from other institutions after serious incidents elsewhere. Each transfer added new risk. Each arrival brought unknown dynamics into an already fragile environment. By the late 2010s, Wakefield carried a reputation unlike any other prison in the UK, not simply for who it held, but for the constant balance required to prevent crisis. And then inspectors uncovered something deeply concerning. Despite layers of security, some prisoners still managed to exert influence beyond their cells, raising fears that control inside Britain's most secure prison might not be as absolute as intended. What investigators discovered next would force authorities to reassess how power actually functioned behind Wakefield's walls. The limits of maximum security. As scrutiny around HM Prison Wakefield intensified, official inspections began focusing on a difficult question. What happens when even maximum security reaches its limits? Reports from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons revealed a complicated reality. On paper, Wakefield remained one of the safest and most controlled institutions in the country. Escape risks were extremely low, and physical security systems functioned as designed. Yet safety inside a prison is not measured only by walls and locks. Inspectors noted that managing long-term high-risk prisoners required constant stability among staff, something increasingly difficult to maintain across the UK prison system during this period. Budget pressures and staff turnover meant that experienced officers were sometimes replaced by newer personnel still learning how to operate within high-security environments. Wakefield's challenges were becoming systemic rather than isolated. Some prisoners, held under strict supervision for many years, developed patterns of resistance that did not rely on physical force. Non-compliance, protest behavior, and organized refusals disrupted routines and demanded large operational responses. Each incident required negotiation, planning, and specialist intervention teams. The prison was secure, but maintaining daily order required enormous effort. At the same time, advocacy groups and oversight bodies raised concerns about conditions within segregation and closed supervision centers across the country, including Wakefield. Questions were asked in Parliament and within justice reviews about whether extreme containment alone could successfully manage the most complex offenders. The debate was no longer only about punishment or security. It had become a national discussion about balance, between protection of the public, safety of prison staff, and the long-term management of individuals considered too dangerous for normal prison life. Wakefield stood at the center of that debate. Despite its fearsome reputation and the nickname, the Monster Mansion, the prison revealed something unexpected. Even the strongest system depends not only on control, but on people, resources, and constant oversight. And as reforms were proposed across the UK prison network, one final question remained unresolved. Had Wakefield exposed weaknesses unique to one prison? Or was it revealing deeper challenges facing the entire modern correctional system? Reform, oversight, and an unfinished debate. Following repeated inspections and growing public attention, HM Prison Wakefield entered a period of reassessment. The Ministry of Justice and prison authorities began introducing wider reforms across the UK prison system, many shaped by lessons learned from facilities like Wakefield. Increased recruitment campaigns aimed to restore staffing levels, while additional training focused on managing high-risk behavior through communication, intelligence gathering, and conflict prevention. The goal was not to make prisons harsher. It was to make them more stable. At Wakefield, operational strategies gradually shifted toward closer monitoring of prisoner welfare alongside security enforcement. Mental health services received greater attention, recognizing that managing risk involved understanding behavior patterns rather than responding only after incidents occurred. Independent monitoring boards continued regular visits, documenting both improvements and ongoing concerns. Some reports noted progress in staff engagement and safety procedures. Others warned that long-term challenges remained, particularly when dealing with prisoners serving extremely long or whole-life sentences. For many inmates, release was unlikely. That reality created a unique management problem. How do authorities maintain order among individuals who may never leave custody? Wakefield became a testing ground for this question. Officers were required to maintain professional boundaries while preventing hopelessness from turning into disruption. Stability depended on routine, fairness, and consistent enforcement of rules. Outside the prison walls, public perception remained divided. To some, Wakefield represented necessary protection, a place designed to contain individuals who posed serious danger to society. To others, it highlighted the growing complexity of modern incarceration and the limits of confinement alone as a long-term solution. One thing, however, became clear through decades of documented history. The Monster Mansion was not defined only by the men held inside it. It was defined by the ongoing challenge of balancing justice, safety, and humanity within one of the most demanding environments in the British criminal justice system. And even today, that balance remains a work in progress. Life sentences and the reality of permanent custody. As HM Prison Wakefield continued operating into the modern era, another defining feature began shaping its identity more than ever before: the growing number of prisoners serving whole life or extremely long sentences. Unlike many correctional facilities focused partly on rehabilitation and eventual release, Wakefield increasingly housed individuals who faced the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in custody. This changed the daily reality inside the prison. For prison authorities, managing inmates with no clear release date created challenges very different from ordinary incarceration. Traditional incentives, early release, progression through prison categories, or reintegration planning, carried less influence. Maintaining order depended instead on routine, stability, and consistent professional conduct from staff. Officers were trained to manage behavior through predictability rather than confrontation. Small disruptions could carry larger consequences in an environment where frustration or loss of purpose might build over years or decades. Inspection reports noted that long-term imprisonment required careful monitoring of mental well-being, both for prisoners and staff working continuously in high-pressure conditions. Wakefield officers often worked with the same inmates for many years. Relationships remained strictly professional, yet familiarity became unavoidable. Staff needed to understand personalities, recognize behavioral changes, and prevent escalation before situations developed into security incidents. At the same time, legal challenges surrounding prison conditions began appearing more frequently across the UK. Courts examined issues such as prolonged segregation, access to rehabilitation programs, and prisoner welfare standards, even for those convicted of the most serious crimes. These cases reinforced an important principle within British law. Security measures must still operate within legal and human rights frameworks. Wakefield stood at the center of these debates. The prison represented society's strongest response to serious crime, but also its legal obligation to manage custody responsibly, regardless of an individual's offense. And as years passed, a deeper concern quietly emerged among policymakers. If some prisoners would never leave Wakefield, what did long-term stability truly look like inside a prison built for permanent containment? The answer would begin to unfold as authorities reconsidered how high-security prisons should function in the decades ahead. A prison under constant watch. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, HM Prison Wakefield operated under closer scrutiny than at any time in its history. Independent inspectors, monitoring boards, and justice officials conducted regular reviews, reflecting a wider shift in how modern prisons were evaluated. Security alone was no longer considered enough. Institutions were now judged on safety, fairness, staff well-being, and long-term stability. Wakefield's reputation ensured that every inspection carried national attention. Reports acknowledged that the prison remained highly secure, successfully preventing escapes and maintaining control over some of the country's most serious offenders. However, inspectors also emphasized that stability inside such an environment required continuous effort. Staff retention remained a key concern across the UK prison system. Experienced officers played a critical role in managing high-risk populations, yet recruitment and training cycles meant that institutional knowledge could be lost over time. Wakefield responded by expanding specialist training programs focused on negotiation, behavioral awareness, and de-escalation techniques. Technology also began playing a larger role. Improved surveillance systems, intelligence monitoring, and communication controls were introduced to reduce risks associated with organized disruption inside prisons. Authorities aimed to prevent influence networks from forming within secure wings, an issue previously highlighted in inspection findings. But oversight worked both ways. Prison management itself became accountable to public transparency. Inspection outcomes were published, debated, and reviewed by policymakers, ensuring that even Britain's most secure prison remained subject to civilian authority. This marked an important shift. Wakefield was no longer viewed only as a place of containment, but as an institution continuously examined by law, government, and public expectation. Yet despite reforms and monitoring, one reality remained unchanged. The prison still housed individuals considered among the most dangerous in the country. And maintaining order inside such an environment meant preparing not only for physical threats, but for unpredictable moments capable of testing the system without warning. Because even in the UK's most controlled prison, stability could never be permanently guaranteed. Beyond the reputation. Today, HM Prison Wakefield continues to operate quietly behind its historic walls in West Yorkshire. The headlines that once shaped its image appear less frequently, yet its role within the United Kingdom's justice system remains unchanged. It still houses prisoners assessed as posing the highest level of risk to public safety, individuals whose management demands constant planning, discipline, and oversight. Over time, Wakefield has come to represent more than a single prison. It reflects how modern societies confront the most difficult question within criminal justice. What should happen after sentencing when punishment becomes long-term responsibility? Years of inspections, reforms, and operational changes have shown that maximum security is not a fixed achievement. It is an ongoing process requiring adaptation. Policies evolve. Training improves. Oversight strengthens. But the fundamental challenge remains the same. A prison like Wakefield must protect the public while operating within the rule of law. Every decision, from daily routines to national policy reforms, exists within that balance. Former officials and inspection bodies have repeatedly emphasized that stability inside high-security prisons depends less on force and more on professionalism, consistency, and accountability. The nickname "the Monster Mansion" may suggest fear. Yet the deeper reality tells a different story. Wakefield is not defined only by those imprisoned there, but by the system tasked with managing risk responsibly year after year, often far from public view. And its history leaves society with an enduring reflection. Security alone cannot solve crime. Punishment alone cannot maintain order. And justice systems must continuously evolve to meet challenges that do not disappear once prison doors close. The lesson behind the walls. The story of HM Prison Wakefield is ultimately not about notoriety or reputation. It is about responsibility. Behind every secure facility lies a complex network of officers, policymakers, inspectors, and legal safeguards working to maintain safety while upholding democratic standards. The prison exists as both protection for the public and a reminder of the long-term consequences of serious crime. Understanding institutions like Wakefield helps move conversations beyond fear or assumption toward awareness and informed discussion. Because prisons do not operate separately from society, they reflect it. And how a nation manages its most dangerous offenders says much about its values, its laws, and its commitment to accountability. Thank you for watching this documentary. If you found this educational and informative, consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Your engagement helps support responsible, fact-based storytelling.